It was supposed to be a night of luxury. Soft music, warm lights, the calm movement of a massive cruise ship gliding through the Mediterranean. Inside, thousands of passengers were enjoying what felt like a perfect evening. Dinner had just finished for many. Others were walking along the decks, looking out at the dark sea, taking photos, laughing, living a moment that felt safe, controlled, and far removed from danger. The ship was enormous, a floating city. Multiple decks stacked high, filled with restaurants, theaters, pools, and rooms where people felt completely secure. Because ships like this are not supposed to fail. They are designed for comfort, for stability, for predictable journeys across open water. But that night, something different was happening. Inside the bridge, decisions were being made. The captain, an experienced officer, chose to take the ship closer to the coast than planned. It wasn't part of the standard route. It wasn't necessary. But it had been done before. A maneuver known informally, something meant to impress, to create a moment for those on board, a close pass near the island that would make the journey feel special. From the outside, it might have seemed harmless. A slight deviation. A controlled approach. But at that scale, even small changes carry risk. Because the closer you move toward land, the less room you have for error. The ship continued forward, its massive engines pushing it steadily through the water. On deck, nothing felt unusual. The night was calm. The sea looked still. The lights of the island in the distance added to the atmosphere, making the moment feel almost cinematic. And then, within seconds, everything changed. A sudden jolt. Not loud enough at first to cause panic, but strong enough to be felt across the vessel. Glasses shook. People paused. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Then came the second feeling. Something was wrong. Below the waterline, the ship had struck something solid. A rock formation that tore into the hull with immense force. Steel designed to withstand pressure had been ripped open. A long gash formed along the side of the ship, allowing water to begin rushing in. And water, once inside, does not stop. It spreads. It fills. It changes everything. Inside the lower compartments, systems began to fail almost immediately. Electrical components were affected. Power disruptions started to spread. The ship, once stable and balanced, began to lose that balance. At first, passengers didn't fully understand what had happened. Some thought it was a minor issue. A technical problem. Something that would be fixed quickly. But the crew knew better. They could feel it. They could see it in the systems. The ship was damaged. And not in a small way. Minutes passed and the situation escalated. Water continued to enter through the breach, flooding compartments that were critical for maintaining stability. The ship began to tilt. Slowly at first, almost unnoticeable. Then more clearly. Passengers started to feel it. A slight angle under their feet. An unnatural shift. And with that, uncertainty began to spread. Announcements were delayed. Information was unclear. Crew members moved quickly, but not all of them had the same understanding of what was happening. Some tried to calm passengers, telling them everything was under control. Others were already preparing for something worse, because they knew what flooding at that level meant. The ship was losing control of its own balance. Back on the bridge, decisions had to be made quickly. But confusion slowed everything down. The extent of the damage was not immediately clear. Systems were failing. Communication was not perfect. And in moments like this, hesitation costs time. Time that cannot be recovered. The tilt increased. Not dramatically at first, but enough that movement became uncomfortable. Plates slid. Objects shifted. Passengers began asking more questions, their voices carrying tension now instead of curiosity. What is happening? Why are we tilting? Is this normal? No one had clear answers. And then the lights flickered. For a moment, darkness. Then partial power returned. But it wasn't stable anymore. And that was the moment everything changed inside the minds of the people on board. Because when the lights fail, people stop believing everything is under control. Panic doesn't start as chaos. It starts as doubt. And doubt was spreading fast. The ship continued to list to one side, the angle becoming more noticeable with every passing minute. Walking became harder. Standing required effort. The feeling of safety that had existed just moments before was gone, replaced by something heavier. Fear. Real growing fear. Crew members began directing passengers, but not all instructions were clear. Some were told to stay inside. Others were told to move toward lifeboat stations. The lack of consistent communication created confusion, and confusion feeds panic faster than anything else. Outside, the calm sea remained unchanged. The night looked exactly the same as it had before. But inside the ship, everything was different. Water continued to rise in the lower levels. Systems continued to fail. The balance of the ship continued to shift in a direction that could not be easily reversed. And still, the full truth had not been announced, because saying it out loud would change everything. It would mean admitting that the situation was no longer under control, that the ship, this massive floating city, was no longer safe. Minutes passed, then more. And with each one the angle increased. The movement became harder. The tension became unbearable, until one realization began to form in the minds of everyone on board. This was not a small problem. This was something far worse. And no one yet knew how bad it was about to become. As the minutes passed, the atmosphere on the ship shifted from confusion to something far more dangerous. People were no longer just asking questions. They were starting to understand that whatever had happened was not being fixed. The tilt of the ship became impossible to ignore. What had started as a slight angle now forced passengers to adjust their balance with every step. Walking in a straight line was no longer natural. Floors no longer felt level. Objects continued to slide, small at first, then larger, louder, more noticeable. And still there was no clear announcement. That silence made everything worse. Because when people are not told the truth, they begin to imagine it. And imagination in moments like this always goes to the worst place. Crew members moved through the corridors, some calm, some visibly tense. Instructions were inconsistent. Some passengers were told to return to their cabins. Others were directed toward lifeboat stations. The lack of coordination created hesitation, and hesitation began to spread through the crowd. Should they stay? Should they leave? No one knew which decision was right. Meanwhile, below deck, the situation was becoming critical. Water continued flooding into the damaged sections, moving from one compartment to another. The ship's internal systems, designed to contain damage, were being overwhelmed. Power failures increased. More areas lost electricity. Emergency lighting flickered, casting long shadows across narrow hallways. The ship was no longer stable. And stability is everything at sea. Back on the bridge, the pressure was mounting. The captain and officers were now fully aware that the damage was severe. But the response had already been delayed. The window for a clean, controlled reaction was closing fast. And every decision now carried consequences. The ship continued to list further to one side. The angle increased enough that standing still required effort. Some passengers began to lose balance. Others held onto railings, walls, anything they could reach. The illusion of safety was gone. In its place was a growing realization. This ship might not recover. Outside, lifeboats remained in position, but launching them was no longer simple. The angle of the ship affected everything. On one side, lifeboats were now too high above the water. On the other, the tilt made lowering them difficult and unstable. Time was working against them. Because the longer they waited, the harder evacuation would become. Passengers began gathering at lifeboat stations, forming clusters of uncertainty. Some followed instructions. Others moved based on instinct, trying to get closer to the outer decks, closer to any possible exit. Voices grew louder. Not yet panic, but close. Very close. And then came the announcement. Not clear. Not direct. But enough. In order to prepare for evacuation. That single moment changed everything. Because now the situation was real. There was no more pretending. No more waiting for a simple fix. People began to move faster. The controlled atmosphere broke. Panic, quiet at first, started to rise. Crew members tried to organize groups, direct passengers into lifeboats, maintain some level of order. But the conditions made everything harder. The tilt of the ship increased the difficulty of every action. Walking, standing, even holding onto something became a challenge. And in situations like this, control begins to slip. Families stayed close together. Strangers helped each other. Some tried to remain calm, focusing only on the next step. Others couldn't hide their fear anymore. Because now everyone understood the truth. The ship was failing. Back on the bridge, the situation had reached a critical point. The ship was no longer responding normally. Systems were unreliable. The list continued to increase. And then, another moment that would later define everything. The captain made a decision. One that would be questioned. One that would be remembered. Instead of staying in full control of the evacuation, instead of remaining at the center of the response, he left his position earlier than expected. That decision changed the structure of command. And when leadership breaks in a crisis, everything becomes harder. Down on the decks, evacuation continued under pressure. Lifeboats were lowered where possible, but not all of them could be used. Some became stuck. Others were too dangerous to deploy due to the angle. Time kept moving. The tilt kept increasing. And the margin for survival was getting smaller. The ship, once a place of comfort and safety, had become something else entirely. A structure losing control of itself. A space where every second mattered. And as the evacuation continued, one thought began to settle into the minds of everyone on board. They didn't get off soon. They might not get off at all. As the evacuation continued, the situation crossed a line that no one could ignore anymore. What had been tense and uncertain was now fully unstable. The ship's angle had increased to the point where movement itself became a challenge. Walking required effort. Standing still required balance. Every step carried risk. The decks were no longer level. They were slanted, uneven, forcing people to lean, to hold onto railings, to grip anything they could find just to stay upright. Some passengers slipped. Others struggled to climb toward lifeboat stations that were now positioned at impossible angles. And still not everyone had made it out. Lifeboats continued to lower where they could, but the process was no longer smooth. On one side of the ship, boats hung too high, suspended at dangerous heights above the water. On the other, the tilt made it difficult to release them safely. Some boats scraped against the side of the ship. Others jammed halfway down. Every launch carried uncertainty. Would it drop correctly? Would it hit the hull? Would it even reach the water? Passengers hesitated, and hesitation slowed everything. But time was no longer something they had. Inside the ship, conditions were getting worse. More areas lost power. Corridors darkened. Emergency lights flickered weakly, casting shadows that made navigation confusing. The sound of shifting metal echoed through the structure, low and constant, a reminder that the ship was still moving, still adjusting, still unstable. Water had spread further into the lower levels, adding weight where it shouldn't be. That weight pulled the ship deeper into its tilt, making recovery impossible. The point of no return had already passed. Back on the upper decks, panic finally broke through completely. Voices rose. People pushed forward. The controlled lines at lifeboat stations began to collapse under pressure. Some tried to follow instructions. Others moved on instinct, trying to find any way off the ship before it became too late. Crew members did everything they could to maintain order, but the situation had grown beyond simple control. The environment itself was working against them. The angle, the darkness, the noise, all of it feeding into a single reality. This was no longer an organized evacuation. It was a race against time, a race against the ship itself. Some passengers made the decision to act on their own. Instead of waiting for lifeboats, they moved toward the edges, searching for lower points, places where they could climb down or jump. Risky choices, but in their minds, waiting felt even more dangerous. Because the ship kept tilting. More and more. At a certain point, parts of the deck became nearly vertical. Movement in those areas was no longer possible without climbing. People clung to railings, to doors, to anything fixed in place. Gravity was no longer something they could ignore. It was pulling them toward one side, constantly, relentlessly. The scale of the ship, once a comfort, had now become a problem. Distances were longer. Paths were harder to navigate. And escape routes were no longer clear. In the darkness, confusion spread even faster. Some passengers moved in the wrong direction. Others became separated from their groups. Communication broke down as noise and panic overwhelmed instructions. And still, the evacuation continued. Lifeboats that could be launched were filled quickly. Some left with more people than intended. Others with less, launched early out of fear that waiting even seconds longer might make them unusable. Below, in the water, the first boats began to move away from the ship. From a distance, the scene was surreal. A massive vessel, tilted heavily, lights flickering, partially dark, surrounded by small lifeboats carrying people who had just escaped something they could barely process. But not everyone was safe. Back on the ship, many were still trying to find a way off. The angle increased again. A shift, sudden enough to be felt across the decks. People lost balance. Some fell. Others held on barely. The structure groaned under its own weight, a deep, echoing sound that moved through the entire ship. It was no longer just damaged. It was unstable in a way that could not be reversed. And in that moment, the final realization set in for those still on board. This ship was not going to recover. It was not going to stabilize. It was only going to get worse. The question was no longer whether it would stop tilting. The question was how much time remained before it reached a point where escape was no longer possible. And for those still on board, that time was running out. By the fourth phase, the ship had become something unrecognizable. What once felt like a controlled environment, a place of order and luxury, was now unstable, unpredictable, and dangerous in every direction. The tilt had increased so much that parts of the vessel were no longer usable. Entire sections were effectively lost, turned into vertical surfaces that no one could safely cross. Movement had become survival. People no longer walked. They climbed. They pulled themselves forward using railings, door frames, anything fixed to the structure. Gravity worked against them constantly, dragging everything toward the same side of the ship. Every step required effort. Every mistake carried risk. And still there were people trapped inside. In corridors that had gone dark. In cabins where doors no longer opened properly. In spaces where the angle made escape nearly impossible. Rescue efforts from outside had begun to intensify. Boats circled the ship, shining powerful lights across the tilted decks, searching for movement, for signals, for anyone still trying to get out. Voices called across the water, instructions shouted upward, guiding those who could still move toward safer areas. But the situation was chaotic. From below, the ship looked massive, overwhelming, leaning at an angle that seemed impossible for something that size. From above, for those still on board, it felt like the entire world had shifted sideways. Nothing aligned. Nothing felt stable. Lifeboats that had already launched moved further away, creating space for others, but also marking a painful reality. Not everyone had made it off in time. Back on the ship, the remaining crew did what they could, moving through sections that were still accessible, guiding passengers, helping those who were struggling. But the lack of central control had changed everything. Without clear leadership, coordination weakened. Decisions became local, immediate, reactive. And in a crisis like this, that matters. Because structure is what keeps panic contained. And that structure was breaking down. The tilt increased again. A slow shift at first, then more noticeable. Objects that had been stable moments ago began to slide again. Loose items moved across surfaces, picking up speed as they went. The sound of metal against metal echoed through the ship, sharp and unsettling. Water continued to fill the lower sections, adding weight, pulling the vessel further toward the side that was already submerged. The balance was gone. Completely gone. At this point, time was no longer measured in minutes. It was measured in chances. One chance to move. One chance to climb. One chance to reach an exit before it became unreachable. Some passengers made desperate decisions. They moved toward the outer edges, looking for ropes, ladders, anything that could help them descend toward the water or toward rescue boats below. Others stayed where they were, holding on, hoping that help would reach them before conditions became worse. And for some, movement was no longer possible. They were trapped by the angle, by blocked pathways, by doors that would not open against the force of gravity pulling everything downward. Outside, rescue crews continued calling out, coordinating movements, trying to guide people towards safer positions. The operation had become a race not just against time but against the ship itself. Because the ship was still changing, still shifting, still moving toward a final position that would make rescue even more difficult. And then came another shift, stronger this time. The kind that moves through the entire structure at once. People felt it immediately. The ship settled further onto its side, the angle increasing to a point where standing was no longer possible in many areas. Those still on board were forced into positions where holding on was the only option. The horizon itself looked wrong. The sea no longer felt below them. It felt beside them. And in that moment, the final stage began. The ship had come to rest against the shallow seabed near the shore, tilted heavily, partially submerged, locked into a position that would not change quickly. From the outside, it looked like a massive structure frozen in place, leaning at an impossible angle. From the inside, it felt like being trapped inside something that had lost all sense of direction. Rescue teams intensified their efforts. More boats arrived. More lights illuminated the scene. More voices called out across the water. The focus now was clear. Get everyone off. As quickly as possible. Because even though the ship was no longer moving dramatically, it was still dangerous. Unstable. Unpredictable. And for those still inside, every second still mattered. Because even at this stage, one truth remained unchanged. They were still not safe. By the final stage, the chaos had begun to settle, but not in a way that brought comfort. The ship was no longer moving, no longer shifting with sudden force, but what remained was something just as heavy. The aftermath. The Costa Concordia lay on its side, partially submerged, silent in a way that felt unnatural. What had once been a symbol of luxury and safety now looked like a broken structure resting against the edge of the sea. Lights flickered in some sections, completely gone in others. From a distance, It was hard to believe that only hours earlier, thousands of people had been living normal moments inside it. Rescue operations continued, but the focus had changed. Most of the passengers had made it off. Lifeboats had carried them to safety. Others had been rescued directly from the ship by crews working through the night. But not everyone had been accounted for. And that changed everything. Because now the mission was not just evacuation. It was search. Rescue teams entered the ship carefully, moving through tilted corridors that no longer resembled the layout they had been designed with. Floors had become walls. Walls had become floors. Navigation inside the vessel was confusing, disorienting, and dangerous. Every step had to be planned. Because inside the ship was still unstable. Water continued to fill lower sections. Some areas were completely flooded. Others were partially submerged, creating traps where movement was slow and visibility was almost zero. Divers worked both inside and outside the vessel, searching through compartments, checking spaces where people might still be trapped. Each area cleared brought answers, but not always the ones they hoped for. Above the ship, helicopters circled, their lights scanning the decks, supporting the operations below. Boats remained in position, ready to respond, ready to assist, ready for anything that might still change. But the urgency had shifted. The race against time had slowed into something more methodical. Because now, every action had to be precise, every movement careful, and every discovery confirmed. Meanwhile, the story of what had happened began to spread beyond the scene. News reports reached across the world. Images of the tilted ship filled screens. A massive vessel lying on its side, close to shore, looking almost unreal in its position. People asked the same question everywhere. How could this happen? How does a modern cruise ship, built with advanced systems and safety measures, end up like this? The answers slowly began to take shape. The decision to move closer to shore. The delayed reaction after impact. The lack of clear communication during the early stages of the emergency. And one detail that stood out more than anything else. The captain leaving before the evacuation was fully complete. That detail changed the narrative. Because in moments like this, leadership defines outcomes. And when leadership fails, everything else becomes harder. Investigations would later confirm the sequence of events, step by step. Not just what happened, but how decisions influenced the result. Because disasters like this are rarely caused by a single moment. They are built from choices. From actions taken, or not taken. From time lost, when time matters most. For the passengers, the experience didn't end when they reached land. What they had gone through stayed with them. The sudden shift from safety to fear. The confusion. The struggle to escape. The realization that something so large, so secure, could fail so quickly. And yet, many had survived. Because despite everything that went wrong, there were still systems that worked. Crew members who acted. Rescuers who arrived. Moments where decisions, even under pressure, led to survival instead of something worse. But the loss could not be ignored. Lives had been taken. Families affected. And a disaster that could have been prevented had become real. As the days passed, the Costa Concordia remained where it had come to rest, a visible reminder of everything that had happened. Not hidden, not removed, just there. A symbol of what can go wrong when small decisions lead to larger consequences, of how quickly control can be lost, and of how important every moment becomes when something begins to fail. From beginning to end, the story followed a clear path, a decision, an impact, a delay, a loss of control, and a fight to survive. And in that path was the lesson. Because disasters like this are not just about what happens in the final moments. They begin earlier, in choices that seem small at the time, until one moment brings everything together. The Costa Concordia was meant to be a journey of comfort. Instead, it became a reminder that even the largest, most advanced systems in the world are only as safe as the decisions behind them.